get stuck to pose those questions, to let us know what they are. And so this is a beginning, and Robin Fay has kindly agreed to do this introductory workshop, and there'll be a follow-up workshop in a couple of weeks' time. So we want you, in the meantime, to start playing and see where you get stuck and bring back your questions. Robin is a user support, a systems consultant, general helper and publicist and propagandist for Omeka. And she's going to take care of this workshop. I'm going to step off, but I'll be back in 25 minutes. So Robin, thank you very much for agreeing to do this.
I'll come and help you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I will keep an eye as best I can on the waiting room. I know there's some people still coming in, so I will keep an eye on that. I am the Omeka Training and Outreach Specialist, so exactly what Keith was talking about, and I do a lot of training for Omeka. So I'm going to go ahead and turn myself off. There's no reason for you all to see me, but hello, you can see what I look like. All right, so I'm going to stop my video because we're really going to focus on Omeka S. We are recording, and we're just going to dive right in. If you have questions, let me make sure I can see the chat. So I will be,
Thank you.
I have the chat going so I can see the chat. And then the other thing is I'll be admitting people to our space as they come in. So we may have maybe a little bit chaotic just as we get started here because so many people are wandering in. So what is Omeka S? It is an open source product, so it is free to use in terms of the software itself. It is a web publication system. It's used by universities, galleries, libraries, museums, and it consists of a local network of independently created exhibits. And one of I think the nicest things about Omeka S is that you can build a pool of items and media and metadata that you can share, not only between the various sites, but of course, within the larger world too. So we're going to kind of go through some of the terminology, and then we're going to look at examples. And then I'm going to actually show you what the back end looks like. So one of the really nice things about Omeka S is that you can have one person or a team of people who kind of oversee the installation as a whole. And then from there, you can have really as many sites as your server can support. The only limitation is really what your server can do. So you can create and manage many sites with that one Omeka S installation. There's a variety of user roles, so you can have people working at different levels in Omeka S, which I know I've worked a lot of times with like student workers and things like that. So you can assign, have ways that you can have work that they can do. You can also connect to the semantic web through publishing items with linked data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. And then one of the sort of features of all the Omeka products is that you can extend them, extend that functionality with modules. And so things that you could do would be, you can create a map, you can use modules to import content from other places. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. You can also use it to use different vocabularies, and we'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes too. You can also style each site differently. So each site can be its own unique resource, and then it can have its own design, it can have its own users, it can have, it can be a completely fully functioning space in terms of what's available there. And most, at least the themes that we create and support, and we're going to talk a little bit in a second about sort of what we create and support versus what the larger community creates and support. But in terms of what we create and support, our themes are responsive, so they are mobile friendly. So that's kind of what it is, where kind of what you can do with it. It's really a way to be able to curate and describe resources. And I came to Omeka like a lot of people come to Omeka, where I was looking for something to create a digital exhibits, but I was also looking for something to create an institutional repository. And I had some other things I needed to create. We wanted a place to put some OER resources that we were working on, all that kind of stuff. We are a consortia of 3 community colleges. And of course, each college had its own needs in terms of what it wanted to do and what it wanted to put into this resource. And I started looking around at what was out there, and I found Omeka, and I was like, wow, this is fantastic. It can do exactly what I want it to do. And it can do exactly what you want it to do. It can take a little bit of work sometimes to kind of figure that out. And we're going to talk a little bit about sort of some tips and planning, but it really is designed to build digital exhibits, and digital exhibits can look like anything just about. So you can have a digital exhibit that looks more like, well, it can even look more like a web page, or it can look more like a book page, or it can look more like, you know, something with a map and resources pinned on it and things like that. So you can have a variety of ways that you present information from those exhibits. So Omeka does provide mechanisms for organizing and describing resources. I also worked a lot in like digital archives and the metadata aspect of work. So, you know, for me, it's like organizing and describing. I'm always interested in knowing about that. And then, of course, you can create exhibits of those resources. It does give you a way through the exhibits to provide additional contextual information, or you can create pages that are just, you know, sort of like about pages, or maybe pages about the grant project or about the people working on it and things like that. It provides a user experience for accessing those resources. And then it does provide mechanisms for publishing data in standard formats. So it is semantic web friendly, and you can extend it to work with a variety of vocabularies. So you can create relationships between your resources, and the resources that are in Omeka are items, item sets, and the medium. We're going to look at all these in just a few minutes. You can, of course, share resources between sites, or you can limit them to specific sites. And you can also, of course, with your user roles, you can define exactly what people do with those items and media too. They're built into it are 3 metadata vocabularies, but you do have the ability to add much more, and we're going to look at those in just a few minutes. You can build templates for your content. So once you kind of figure out, like, you know, how you want to describe a particular resource, you can actually build out that resource template that you can reuse. So you can share your templates with colleagues, or you can share them on the open web. You know, it kind of depends upon what you want to do. I already mentioned that each project can have its own site with its own design, so they don't have to look the same. And one of the things that I think can be a little bit confusing to people sometimes, especially coming into Omeka, is that Omeka has a public interface, and then there's the staff side or work side of the interface. So you have both what the public sees and then, you know, where the work happens. So within those individual sites, or within an individual site, a site is made up of pages. So that's kind of the construction of a site. And of course, within a site, you can have multiple levels. Whatever is on the top becomes the main navigation. You can have many layers underneath of that. One of the best suggestions I can give you to kind of get started is to think sort of about the resources or content that you would be interested in putting into an Omeka site, and then think a little bit about how you would want to organize that. Because there are multiple approaches to planning a site, but really the planning part of it is the key. And I just can't stress the planning part of it enough, because you want this to you want to figure out what your workflow is going to be going forward. And yes, you can adapt and adjust, and you may think like, oh, well, I tried that and it didn't work very well, so I want to try something else. And that's certainly, you know, completely acceptable to kind of experiment and figure out what you want to do. And that's really going to be the the place you're going to start is sort of that experimentation and then figuring out what you want to do. But things to consider, at the very, very highest level is like, what kind of site are you building? So what is the purpose of what you're going to be building? Who is going to be your primary audience? Who's going to be your secondary audience? What are the goals of what you're going to build? What do you want people to take away from the site that you would build? And then even just the very basic, like, how are you going to welcome and orient people? How are they going to know what this site's about? And then this may be the easiest part of it, or maybe not, depending on what resources you have in mind, but what resources do you need to include and what do you want to highlight? So the resources that you have that you need to include, those would be sort of the things you would get started with. And then the what do you want to highlight, that would be those exhibits that you're going to build or those pages you're going to build. And then finally, we should always be thinking about, how are we going to credit the people who work on the site? What rights are going to be associated with the materials we're working with? And, then thinking also about what best practice or standard we're going to apply for the description of those resources. And we're not going to talk too much about like the actual metadata part of it, but that's something to kind of put into your a plan as you're thinking about it. Like, are we going to use Dublin Core? Are we going to use something else? And what fields would we want to use? And, are we going to use rights.org? Are we going to use something else? And then really kind of looking at that, because putting those things in place sort of at the beginning, and like I said, you can adjust as you need to, but putting those things in place at the beginning will make the whole process go easier, and you're not going to be going back and having to re-edit and change things as you go along. Although you can do that, it's just going to be more work. It's going to take you a little bit more time. So there's a variety of ways to kind of do content planning. I've kind of covered some of the basic questions for content planning. I'm a Post-it note person. If I turn my video back on, I could pull out all my Post-it notes and show you all the colors I have. I'm a Post-it note person. So you could do something like that. You could do Post-it notes. And Post-it notes are kind of fun if you're going to be working as a group or a team, because then you can even use a wall or you can use a whiteboard and people can kind of move things around and reorganize things. And so this is a way that you can kind of plan sort of what the structure of your site would look like what the scope of your site would look like. And you can also even identify like some of the resources that you may want to put into this particular site. So I like Post-it notes, but you can use other things. There's also Google Jamboard that you can work on collaboratively. You can do just an outline. Some people just kind of like to do a basic outline, because this will help you then see how your site will be constructed at that infrastructure level. And that will be one of the decisions you'll be making, is not only what kind of resources we're going to put into this and what we're going to call it, what's the name of it going to be, what's the scope of the site going to be, but then it's also going to be, how are we going to organize those resources? And so doing this kind of approach can be very helpful in terms of helping to organize the resources and also helping organize with that information architecture, that infrastructure that you're going to put into place. And like I said, you can kind of adjust and adapt as you go along, but having a plan to get started will make the site building go much more smoothly, and you'll be able to get into some of the other areas you may want to focus on. So you may want to spend more time on looking at modules and seeing how you can extend it to do exactly what you want it to do. Or you may want to, if you have a whole bunch of resources you want to put into an Omeka, then you may want to think more about like the metadata, best practices and things like that. But having that sort of structure to get you started is going to be helpful. So let's look at the infrastructure of it. And like I said, we're going to actually look at examples of this in a few minutes. We're just right now kind of going through terminology. So items are the basic building blocks of a Omeka site. And these would be the resources that you're going to be working with. So an item is an object that you have media and information about And in theory, it would be things that you would want to eventually put into an exhibit or a page. So for example, I might want to create an exhibit about historical architecture. Architectural plans of a single building would be the item. I could provide contextual information, including things like, what am I going to call these? I might call them, architectural plans of the Sears building or something like that. What am I going to call them so that people know what they are? Then I might include information about who created it and, what rights or copyrights associated with it. Can other people reuse this? Am I going to allow them to reuse it? Or do I have permission to use it in some way and I want to express that to people? And then a general description of what it is. Of course, this contextual information, for those of you who've worked with sort of traditional metadata, that's really the heart of that traditional metadata, that contextual information that we may want to include. Omeka supports the use of Dublin Core, but it also supports other vocabularies, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. Then, so we have our items, and then we're going to group our items together. And we can group our items kind of however we want. So if looking at that architecture example, I might want to create a set of all of the architectural plans. So that's how I'm going to organize those. And then I might have a second set that can be photographs of completed buildings. So, I have the plans and then I have photographs of the completed buildings. And then I might have a third set that's like planning documents or other documentation related specifically to that building project. Of course, each of these sets could consist of several items or many items, depending on what you have, but I'm going to use those item sets to organize things. So then in Omeka, I would be able to click on each of the items. I'd be able to see that item, see that associated metadata. And then I can also, at a higher level, I can add some metadata about that item set as well. Of course, item sets can be shared or limited to specific sites. So it can be shared across all the sites as a pool, or it can be limited to just specific sites. So mentioned this already, that you can share a pool of resources across sites. So if there are things that you would want to share with others, at least from, building pages, building an exhibit kind of thing, you could certainly do that. That pool of resources could be used to build exhibits and pages from those resources, and it's a way to curate that content. Of course, you can also add new items or add items individually. We're going to look at this again in a second too. You can, of course, do this in a variety of ways. I would suggest that, of course, you're going to create your site first, but as you're creating your site, or sort of before you create your site, I would go back to sort of that list of questions and think through, like, what is this site going to be about? How am I going to organize it? Or at least kind of nail down some of the basics of that. And then after I created the site, I would do the same sort of thing. What resources do I have and how am I going to organize them? So I would create the site first, then I create my item sets. And then when I'm doing actually adding items, I've already got those. Well, I have to have a site to add something to it first, but that would also, be helpful as well. If you're going to share a pool of resources, then at that point, those resources could be added and then people could build their sites and pull from those resources to create those exhibits. So if you're going to share a pool of resources across multiple sites, then there'll be a little bit more decisions to make as you go along in terms of like exactly how what you're going to share and how you're going to share that with everybody. If you're going to limit resources to individual sites, then in that way, you can create your site, add those resources, and then do your item sets. Sites, I've mentioned this already, and we're about to jump in and start looking at some examples and talk our way through them. But sites are made up of pages, and pages are made up of blocks. And we're going to actually look at what this means, but a block is just a way to display content. You can move them around on a page, And this can be items. So this could be the items that you want to feature. It can be media, it can be text. So if you want to write something about a photograph or write something about a manuscript, if you want to include a little more information about it, you can do that. They are movable, so you can move them all around. There are mapping blocks, so you can create a map view, and we're going to explore all of these in just a few minutes. I did want to mention permissions, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but you'll have the, I'll kind of hit the high points, but there are 6 user roles. The global admin has full installation privileges for everything. So that would be the person who's going to oversee your Omeka as a whole. And then sort of if you go down from there, supervisor has full privileges. They can create, edit, and delete. They can work with users. They can't do as much with modules. So that would be something to kind of figure out is like, who's going to oversee the Omeka S installation at that higher level, and then who's going to really deal with the modules, and then also the vocabulary. So a supervisor can read and create privileges for vocabularies, but they can't delete them. And deleting them may not be that big of a deal. I mean, if you've used one of the modules that supports other vocabularies like RDA or some OCLC metadata services or something like that, you know, it may be fine just to leave it and not worry about deleting it either. Editors kind of down one more level, and the editor can create, edit, and delete items, item sets, media, resource templates, and site pages. They can then search, read, create sites and users. They can do all that, but they can only, in terms of sites, they can only edit or delete their own sites. So they can't go up to that more global level. Reviewers, this is a person who can search, read, create, and edit all items, item sets, and media, but they can only delete their own stuff. And they have to be added to a specific site in order to be able to do that work. And then you can kind of go down even from that. So, you know, one of the things that you'll be thinking about is who will be working on your Omeka installation with you and what sort of user role they need to have. So if you're going to have students working with you, or maybe you have a graduate student working with you, and then you're going to have some undergraduates or some other participants working with you. Maybe you have volunteers that's going to be working with you, or you have other staff people that will be working with you. What will their user roles be? So I would, you know, as you're kind of thinking about your site, and I'll be sharing resources with you beyond just what's here, but as you're thinking about your site, one of the things you would be thinking about also is, you know, who's going to be working with me on this? It may just be me, I've been there, or you may have other people who are working with you. And if you do have other people who'll be working with you, then what user role are you going to set up for them? And you don't have to necessarily make this decision right now. You can kind of get your site going and put some items in, and you know, you'll be able to play with Omeka first to kind of figure out how it works, but you will need to make this decision certainly before they start doing work in terms of what is it that you're going to have them do and which user role do they need. The researcher is a very limited user role. It's really only allows people to search in Omeka S and then read only privileges. So if you have somebody, like when I worked on a grant project, I needed to give the grant project manager and some of the other members of the grant team, or they needed to write reports and things like that about the work that we were doing in terms of the grant. And so I gave them the researcher role, so they could go in, they could see the work that was being done, they could make their notes in terms of what was happening, but they had no privileges to do any work, and they didn't see like all the editing and stuff like that. So they could just go in and see and make notes in terms of what they needed to do. And so you may have people in that particular role who need to be able to just go into the back end and see what's going on, or they may just want to take a look at the public interface, and that's really all they need to do too. So we've kind of talked about some of the administrative decisions to make and a little bit about how Omeka works. The other two aspects of it are the design aspect. So what will it look like? And that's really driven by the theme and theming. And we do support numerous themes, and you can certainly try out anything you want to try out. But we support certain themes, and I'll just show you quickly. So if you go to omeka.org/s/themes, you'll see all the ones that not only we support, but other ones that are contributed by the community. So since Omeka is an open source community, not only do we create things, and you'll see underneath here, it says Omeka team, and there's our icon there. That says that is a theme that we have created, so we know it's responsive, and we know it works well with Omeka. So, anytime you see the Omeka team on our modules or our themes, that's something that we've created and that we support. There's many more beyond just that. So certainly you can, that's a decision, and you may talk about it and kind of make that decision as a group in terms of, do we want to just use an Omeka team modules and themes, or do we want to look at themes together and look at modules together, or do we just want to make that decision on our own? But that's kind of how like what's an Omeka supported and what's the community. So, and you'll see the same thing with the modules too. Themes is a way to change the colors, layout, and sometimes aspects such as graphics. Like, do you have the ability to upload a logo and things like that? We've already talked a little bit about themes. Getting started, you would select a theme. There are different options for different themes. And so as you go through, like working with themes or working with modules, you'll just want to make sure to really go through and make sure you've checked your settings. I have given you also a contrast checker. So if you are wanting to change colors, or your theme has the ability to change colors, now if it's one of the themes that we have created, we have already done this work for you. We check to make sure and do lots of testing actually for accessibility purposes to make sure that our themes have good high contrast colors. If you are using someone else's theme, which you're certainly free to use any theme that you find that's an Omeka S theme that fits your version of Omeka, but any of the other third-party themes, you may just want to kind of take a look if you're adjusting the colors and make sure that they're going to have a high contrast so that they will meet accessibility requirements, at least in the United States, but I know that globally we have lots of different accessibility requirements. Each theme does interact a little bit differently with Omeka. So things you might do within a theme is set the number of search results per page, or you may change what displays on those pages on the browse results page too. I already talked a little bit about modules. This is how we extend and really make Omeka do a lot of amazing things. These usually work behind the scenes. Sometimes they will give you additional functionality just straight out of the box, like the mapping module will allow you to build a map through geolocating your content onto a map. And then other modules help with workflows. And these were things that I relied on heavily because I was importing so much content from other places. You can use importers to bring in content from a spreadsheet. So if you have something in a Google Sheet or Excel sheet, and you can get it into a CSV file, then you can bring that into Omeka S. If you have an Omeka Classic site and they've set up an API so that you can harvest from that, then you can bring that content into an Omeka S. Of course, you'll need to, once you get the content in, then you're going to have to figure out how to organize it and all that kind of stuff. But you can bring that content in, and you can connect your Omeka S installation with Fedora or the DSpace repositories, and that can be set up to have the ability to update content periodically. So there are a variety of modules that support those very specific functionalities in terms of more workflow kinds of things. Value Suggest is one of probably the best of any module I've seen in terms of providing extended support for metadata. So not only is it Dublin Core, it's geonames, it's the Getty vocabularies, LC Link Data Service, the RDA value vocabularies, rights.org, Onyx, and so many more. So if you are really interested in more of the metadata aspect, and I suspect some of you probably are, then I would definitely take a look at the Value Suggest module. There's a lot of information on our website about it. And you might get a little bit more information and a little bit more thinking about what you might want to do in terms of that. So more on modules. I already mentioned that they often have settings that need to be reviewed or customized. We're going to talk about these more as we look at examples. Again, you can see here as you look at modules, it's a little bit harder to see what's us and what's not us, but you can see the Roy Rosenwig Center for History and New Media, that's us. And you can see some of the other ones that are not us. But again, you can use any of the ones that you want to use that fit into what you need. So I've pulled 3 examples, and we're going to talk through our 3 examples, and then we're actually going to look at the back end. So this is African Brilliance. It's from the Palmer Museum of Art. And you can see here, this is the list of all the plugin or modules that they're using. And we're not going to go through and look at all of these, but I do want to just kind of give you a sneak peek, and we'll kind of talk through some of these. So they have a nice little page when you come in. They have this nice little welcome page. This is just a basic page that they've created that tells a little bit about it. And then when you look under about the collector, that's where you see those pages or those more exhibit sort of pages. And exhibits can look like, as we're looking at these next 3 examples, you'll really be able to see the different ways that people have used exhibits. So this is one example of an exhibit, and we have, an image, we have a little bit of text. These are actually items that we have here. And if we click on one of these, that takes us actually to the item. And the layout and the way that this looks is driven by the theme in terms of the overall design. And then when we were talking about that metadata or that contextual information, this is what they have included down here: the title, description, source, and rights. So that's an example of an item. And we go back one level, then this is an example of that page with all of those blocks that I was talking about. And you can see here we have a lot of different blocks. So each place we have text, there's a block, and then we have images spread throughout. So that's one example. And we can look at another approach. So this is another approach with a page. So these are all pages with those blocks built in. And they've even embedded a video in these. So really nice in terms of what they've done in terms of embedding content. So one of the things that I would suggest doing for those of you who are really interested in seeing what Omeka can do, or interested in kind of thinking about what you might do in terms of building your own, then I would maybe take a look at this one. And because this one has a lot of good examples, and I have listed some of those modules in this. So moving on, like I said, we're going to use 3 Yeah, if everyone would mute, that would be wonderful. I don't seem to be able to mute people, so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see the ability to be able to mute people. So here's another example. And again, it's a little bit different approach. And you know, here's sort of their welcome page. So you're just diving right into the exhibit. So if you click on any of these, and again, we have the menu up here, so you can see how many people they've included in this. But if we click on this, that takes us over to our list. And, you know, this is something they've styled and chosen the colors for and things like that. And then this takes us over to that page with the blocks and our content. So that's another one that's kind of an interesting one to take a look at. Their navigation is really extensive because they've actually put every single person on the navigation that's in their collections. Now, there's other ways of doing this. You could just use a search feature and not list everybody on the navigation. But, you know, they made that choice to list everyone on the navigation. So, and then the other one that I wanted to show you. So this one, again, I've listed the modules that are used. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit because this one is a little bit small on my screen. Same sort of thing. So this is a page with those blocks. And so when we actually look at the back end and you can see how this is constructed, you know, think a little bit about these things. We're just looking at them very quickly, but think a little bit about the websites that we've looked at here in terms of how that information is organized, because each one of these, each section on here is a block that someone has built. You can also see up here, this is their menu. So their menu is very flat. It's a little bit different than the other menus. And that's one of the things to make a decision about too, as you're kind of going along with Omeka, is what the menu looks like. So we will do one more quickly. So I've given you 4 examples that I've pulled out from our showcase. There's a lot more in the showcase at omeka.org/s. So there's a lot more there that you may want to go through. Like I said, I've just pulled out some of the ones to take a look at. But really what I want you to just kind of notice is how they all look very, very different. And the organization is very different. The look, of course, is driven by the design, and the organization is driven by not only the navigation, which we're going to talk about more in just a second, but also then in terms of, you know, really thinking about what their site plan is going to be and how they're going to lay things out in terms of those pages with those blocks. So that would be one of my suggestions for those of you who think you might want to use Omeka, or if you're not still sure, you know, maybe go through these examples or go through more of the examples in the showcase and see if there's something that feels like more of what you might want to do. So let's look at behind the scenes, and I'm going to show you a few things. So this is the behind the scenes part of it. So we've looked at the public interface for Omeka sites. And of course, the behind the scenes looks very different, right? It's a little bit kind of just plain, and there's not a lot of graphical kind of stuff going on because it really is that working space. So we have several sites here, and we're just going to take a look at a couple of them. Whoops. All right, now I've lost my place. There I am. All right, so we're just going to take a look at a couple of our sites. All right, so this one is it's just for demo purposes. There's not a lot there. So this would be the public interface of what we were sort of like what we were just seeing. So you can see from the examples we were looking at, those are really robust in terms of what's been included and what's been built. These are a little bit, little less robust really for example purposes. So we do have pages within our mall history content. And here's an example of that mapping. So this is a page and it uses the mapping module. And you can then, we don't have a whole lot on here, but you can then pin things to that particular map. So that's one example of something you can do in terms of creating content. So I want to show you what a page actually looks like. So these are pages that have all been created. If we wanted to add a new page, we could do that really easily. For the sake of time, I'm just going to show you, kind of open one and you can see what it looks like. So here's an example, daily life on and around the mall. And if we are to view it, you know, there's not much there, but what is there is this section here that's a table of contents. And if we go back to our page, our editing page, we see that we have a block here for table of contents. And all of our blocks are over here on the right. And you see we have here HTML, we have maps, and we have maps by a couple of different ways. We have a media embed, we have an item showcase where we can pull things together in that way. There's that table of contents. We have an item with metadata, so we can include that. So we could really build this particular page to look exactly what we want, like what we want it to. So, you know, if we want to include just some basic information, we wanted to write a little bit more about it. So we can do that. We can include links here. We can do all the sort of normal things you might want to do. So we just added that and we're going to save it. And then if we come over here and refresh and view it, I didn't write very much, but there's an example of how you can put some text in. And of course, we could include links, we could include images, we could include all sorts of things in those pages. So when we create a site, so here's our site, all history content. We create a site, we create our pages, and here's our resources down here. So we've already preloaded in our items. We've already created our item sets. So that information's there. We've already done our metadata description for our items. And if we go in and we look, we have lots of untitled stuff because we've just dumped 2,500 things in here. But we'll pull, see if we can pull one of these. This one looks like it does not have anything to it. That's one thing that's happened sometimes when you import things, is sometimes you just get things that don't have a lot of metadata. And you'll see here we have, you know, a little bit of batch processing here where you can edit all, or you can delete. So let's say you import a bunch of stuff. I wouldn't delete all, but you might delete selected. So let's say you import a bunch of stuff and it just doesn't work properly, or you want to redo it, or maybe you're going to redo your spreadsheet and then re-import it, and you know, so that it's a little bit more cleaned up. You can certainly do that, and you can go in and just, you know, select out what you want to delete out. So let's see if I go the other way. All right, so here's something that actually has some metadata. So if we look at this, this has a resource. This is a person. We're using the friend of a friend information. And for those of you who do metadata work, you'll notice, you know, it has metadata work, that metadata fields that you would expect to see. So that's sort of what an item looks like. So you can add in your items, do your description. They can either have media associated with them. So you upload media, and here's how you upload over here. Or if you want to link to something else. So let's say we were doing something about, we're going to do something about Sherlock Holmes, and we're going to link to things out on the web besides what we actually own and upload to this. We could add those URLs. So if we found videos that we liked, we have the ability to add a YouTube video, or if we found images elsewhere that we might want to associate as we're creating this page, we could do that too. So we could add all of those things as items as we would want to. So for items, items do not just have to be things that are uploaded. They can also be things that you curate across the web. So beyond what you may have in-house that you want to feature, things that you've digitized, you can also add things through URLs. Or perhaps maybe your department or university or a project that you've worked on, you've created YouTube videos and you want to add those into your page as you're creating that more of an exhibit approach. You can certainly do that using Omeka. Of course, items are assigned to an item set. And so, like I said, when we were talking about this at the very beginning, one of the easiest ways to do this after you create your site and you sort of have an idea of how things are going to be organized and what resources, of course, understanding that resources are probably going to be continued to be added to it, but what resources you want to include, having those item sets set up to begin with will make it a little bit faster, because that's one area where as you're adding your items, you don't have to go back and do that work again and add them to an item set. And item sets can be, depending on what theme you use and how you set up your site, they can display and people can actually browse those item sets too. So we've talked a little bit about items. We've talked a little bit about item sets. That's how we organize the items. So this is really more for us, although depending on your theme or whether or not you're going to allow people to browse the item sets, this can be a way to also organize your Omeka S. So they can be a tool that people can browse, much like if you're in a bookstore and you go to the mystery section and you browse in the mystery section. Item sets function the same way in Omeka S, where people can go there and they can browse whatever's in that particular set. Of course, the other thing you can do is build that page or more of that exhibit-like approach where you can actually curate that experience. And not only are you pulling things from, you don't have to pull things from just one item set, you can pull things from multiple item sets and really build that, really curated experience. You can also provide more contextual information like writing text and other things like that that accompany what is going on with your page or your exhibit. So those are really sort of the basic features of how a site works on the back end. You have your items, which are your resources, and those are the things that have the metadata description. And I'm just going to go back the other way because I know none of those have them. But, depending on what kind of resource it is, it will have more or less of metadata description. It may depend upon what kind of metadata you have already or what kind of metadata work you're going to be doing for this. And what kind of information are you going to provide about this? You can have multiple media associated with an item. So if you have a whole bunch of things, maybe a whole bunch of photographs, you can have them sort of associated with one item and describe them as sort of a collection of sorts. And then, of course, we already talked about item sets. Item sets is just, that is the way that we describe or organize our items. So we have items, that's our basic block of what we have in Omeka. Then we have the set is sort of how we describe it. or describe it how we organize it. And then that set can be used, and the items themselves can be used to, we can allow people to browse the items. We can allow people to browse the item sets. Some of that's driven by your theme. And then we can also build those pages, or we can build those pages or exhibits so that we can really feature that content in terms of that. So just skipping back here. Did want to talk, we looked at mapping just briefly. We talked a little bit about mapping. Really what I want you to just know about mapping is that yes, you can do mapping. You do need to be able to provide those geographic coordinates for a particular resource. So that is something you would include in the metadata in order to be able to have mapping. Or the other way of doing it is you can actually take your map and then pin things on it. So you can do it that way too. Mapping sometimes can be a little tricky depending upon, what kind of map you want to use. There's a variety of maps that are supported with mapping, but some of them can get a little more tricky than others. Also, if all of your resources are going to be in a very small area, a very small local area, then of course that can be a little bit more challenging in terms of displaying on a map too. Just like when you look at any map, if everything's really in the same location, then you have to zoom into that map, and you may have to zoom in more than the software can really handle. So we talked a tiny bit about navigation. We haven't talked too much about it. As you noticed when we were looking at some of those sites that we were actually looking at. And again, I would suggest that you take some time and go through those sites, spend a little more time, look at them, think about the pages, the construction of them, think about how they've organized the pages in terms of, really being able to look at those blocks and sections, like how they've organized things. Take a look at the navigation or the menu, because navigation is the pathway through those sites. So take a look at those. Home is home, and we always need to be able to get there. And that's true for our users when they're looking at our Omeka installations too, and our sites. They need to be able to get where they want to go. Always, I think this can be a struggle sometimes for us in academia. Keep language simple and concise. Don't leave your audience stranded. So if you are building, and a page that's going, you can chain pages together to create that, next and back sort of more exhibit experience. If you do that, then when they get to the end of it, sort of figure out how you're going to let them know that they're at the end, or maybe send them someplace else. Like, well, if you liked this, then maybe you should go look at this exhibit instead, or something like that. So think a little bit about what the logical flow would be and where they're going to go. We talked about talked a little bit about a content plan and talked about that process for thinking about a content plan. The content plan can help guide your navigation, and it can help guide your site organization. The other thing to think about, of course, is the flow between resources. So this really is going to vary from site to site, because it's going to depend upon what kind of resources that you are going to put into Omeka-S. You may already have a hierarchy. So you may already have things, maybe you have them in a collection, maybe you are digitizing things in a specific way, or maybe you might have things in folders. So maybe you have things organized, and here's our archives, and we have these folders on the server, or folders on a flash drive, and those folders then could be something that could help guide your content plan. So think about what you've already done with the resources that you want to include in Omeka. It may be that you've already done some work that you can apply to Omeka, like, oh, well, we have folders and we're going to look at the folder names, and maybe that's how we're going to organize our Omeka site. We may already have a hierarchy in place, or maybe we are starting to digitize resources, and one of the things we're going to think about is what that hierarchy would be, or how the items are going to be related to each other, or how they should be related to each other. So you can think about the resources you already have and how you've organized them already, and then look at things like the navigation, look at things like building the pages and the exhibits, look at things like the item sets to then figure out how you can take that analog approach and move that over to a more of a digital approach. Like, can that be used as part of your navigation, or can that be used, is that going to be how you're going to create your sets or your collections? And then also the other thing is, if you have content you want to import from other resources, if you have content that you want to import from other websites, or content you want to import from Fedora or DSpace, or you have stuff in a spreadsheet, all of that can be imported in. It's just a matter of figuring out what you have and then using the appropriate tool to do that. We already talked a little bit about the modules in terms of what they can do for you, but they really can. And feel like I've imported just about every kind of resource into an Omeka at some point. So it just takes a little bit of patience and a little bit of working out the mapping in terms of mapping the data into what you're currently working on, because of course what you may be getting from a particular website or project is not going to necessarily map exactly to match up exactly to what you have in Omeka. So it's just a little bit of work to get it going, but you can import just big bunches, thousands of things at a time without a whole lot of work. I mean, it takes a little bit of work to get it set up, but then once your import happens, it's usually very straightforward. And then at that point, there's some decisions to be made about, okay, we've got the content in, we've got those items in, we've got our media in, now what? Now what do we do with the stuff since we've gotten into Omeka? So, also think about what you expect to see on a website, because these are, all the Omeka sites are websites. Things like a way to get back to the beginning, a way to find resources, information about the project itself, all of that kind of stuff. If you have a marketing team or a PR person or somebody who's just good at writing that sort of marketing verbiage, promotional verbiage, then that might be a good person to just reach out to in terms of like, hey, we need something really catchy on that front page to kind of grab people's attention. Can you help us write some verbiage and things like that? So, thoughts for consideration, kind of following up on that marketing standpoint, think about your branding. There are ways that you can put logos, and you'll notice that on some of the sites you look at, they have logos on them, things like that. Branding, link consistency. Are there links that should be shared between these sites? Do you want to have any kind of connection between these sites? And if so, you can add custom links to the navigation. So you can also add links to your university, links to your library, links to other archives. You can add that into your navigation. Your navigation isn't just what is within your Omeka site. So you can certainly connect things that way. You can connect things through your resources. And on that note, we are right at 1 hour. And so are there any questions? Or any final thoughts? Do you have you been thinking about what kind of resources you might want to what kind of resources you might want to put into Omeka, or do you already have projects that you want to work on? I see several of you have raised your hand. Are you asking a question?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Oh, all right. Let me just go through. So S. Merlot,
Hi, my name is Stefania, but of course he's not there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
yes.
you very much for your presentation. I am particularly interested in the mapping functions, and I was wondering whether beyond the mapping, Omeka caters for the storing and display of spatial information like shapefiles or KMZs.
That is a good question. On one of my projects, I actually worked with 3D digital objects in Omeka. And I will take a look at the mapping because I do not know to the extent that it supports like more of that spatial or three-dimensional approach. It was something I kind of had to work through to get it to work for me. But I will take a look at that. I do know it can support GIS, and of course it can support coordinates and things like that. But I will definitely take a look at that, and I've put that on my list to follow up on. It's something I haven't looked at too much lately, so I'll definitely take a look. Other questions about that? That sounds exciting and interesting, though. Deborah?
Hi, Robin. Thank you so much for the presentation. They're really great to see and get a good look around. I just had a quick question about all the different modules. So how does one, I mean, are all the modules openly available? Are all the modules sort of open source? So does one have like an installation and then you can just add modules as you need them? Or how does it work as far as packages go? Which ones are sort of free? Which ones does one pay for, etc.? Thanks.
All of the ones that are on our Omeka website are free. There are, of course, some where people offer sort of advanced customizations and things like that. They may charge for that. Sometimes if people want something sort of advanced from us, we also will do that kind of work and charge for that kind of things that go beyond the call of duty, so to speak. But yeah, anything that is listed here is freely available to use. It just needs to be uploaded. You will need to, of course, pay very careful attention for one, to make sure, as you see here where it says latest version, and to make sure that it actually works with your version of Omeka, which would be the latest version. So most of the time, if they're here, people are actively maintaining them. There are a few that sometimes don't get actively maintained. There's more Omeka. There's so many Omeka modules beyond what's here. There's even some in GitHub that you know, you can get into really experimental stuff out there. You can also build your own. And if you do build your own, or if as a community you were to build your own, then I would suggest we would love to see you register your module, which just means that you submit it here and you know, you share it with everyone else. But yeah, we are open source. Our modules are open source. Everything that's listed here is open source. And really the only sort of caution is one, to make sure it works with your version of Omeka, which is not very hard to figure out. If you go to any of these modules, you'll be very easy to see whether or not it's going to work. The other thing is, from my experience, having gone out and tried some of these very experimental modules at times, you just want to make sure that if you are working with something, especially something experimental, that you back up your Omeka installation before you get started. You back up your site before you get started. And you know, if something would happen, especially with an experimental module, that if something goes wrong, you can roll it back to you know, what you were working on. I didn't have that happen. I only had that happen once, and it was very much an experimental module. It wasn't anything from the Omeka team. It's a little bit harder to tell what's the Omeka team on the modules because we're not kind of sorted in a particular way. But if you kind of scroll through the list, just like with the plugins, you see here it says by Omeka team. That means that is a module that we've created and we support it and we continue to support it. So anytime we make changes to Omeka, which doesn't happen frequently, but when we do an upgrade to Omeka, we also make sure that any module that we support, any module that we create is compatible and works appropriately. So, you know, that's just part of our whole process, is that any module or plugin that we have created is always compatible with Omeka. So
Okay,
you get a little bit more, you know, use with caution with some of the others, but honestly, I've used other third-party plugins that just work beautifully and I had no problems with them at all. And, you know, for safety's sake, whenever you're installing modules or themes, especially third-party things that aren't us, I would say back up first just to make sure everything's going to be okay. All right, Bridget.
Hi, thanks, Robin, very much for the presentation. I have a question. I've actually been working on an Omeka site with a few colleagues in Europe and in Canada. And we have something we're trying to do around labor history, where we each have our kind of own site and it's brought together. And one of my, I've gotten stymied on the issue of copyright. So it's less of an issue for my colleagues who seem to be able to access collections which are kind of publicly available. And I'm struggling with the kinds of items that I can work with because I'm not quite understanding how copyright works on Omeka. And I wondered if the Digital Humanities Project might offer us some assistance, either to figuring that out or to figuring out if it's an issue. I mean, I'm also not a historian, so I get kind of weirded out about, you know, archives and documents, and and it may be a quite simple question, a simple answer. But I wondered if, if that's something, it was more of an issue than I was expecting it to be an issue, in other words.
Well, one thing I can tell you about copyright is that if you are adding media and you're just linking to it, so you're adding a URL and you're just going to link to it, or like a YouTube video, you're not actually downloading that resource to your Omeka, you're just literally linking to it. So it's linking to it like you would link to anything on a website. So in that case, if you're just linking to things, so you can create your item, you can assign all this wonderful metadata that you want to assign for it. You can give it contextual information. You can, you know, say what source it's coming from, give them credit, all of that kind of stuff. You can completely respect your rights in that way. And, you know, really, if you're just adding that URL, you're just linking to it. So we're not downloading those resources at all. So that's one way to kind of address that. It does sound like you've had some a good copyright workshop. So yeah, I do think that's something that you may want to talk a little bit more about. Copyright is very confusing to people. I know when I've worked with other faculty when we were working on one of our institutional repository projects, there was a little bit confusion about what was used in the classroom versus what could be put into the repository. So what could be put into our Omeka versus what they used in the classroom, what fell under fair use. So, you know, it is a very confusing, especially in the United States, because we have certain time periods where, you know, before 1968, this, and, you know, 35 years after the author dies, that. And so copyright here in the United States is it's not the same even for all items. So it gets very, very tricky here in the United States for sure. So yes, I think that may definitely be something for you all to talk about, but I did want to address that if you're linking to a resource, you're not actually downloading that resource. And so in that way, it would be the same as if you did a blog post and linked to it, or you wrote something on your website and linked to it, or you shared it on Facebook and linked to it, you know, that kind of thing. When we do this kind of stuff all the time, where we're just linking to resources, and in that way, you know, we're not, we're still respecting the copyright, because of course people are going back to that source. Now there are times that especially for digital history programs or various collections, I think about photographers a lot where they do not want people to link to those resources. So that does sometimes come up, but in terms of copyright, at least if you're linking to it, you are still respecting their copyright, as long as you're not claiming it as your own. Say something about the potential interface with museum collections management software such as PassPerfect. You know, I've heard of PassPerfect, and I know a tiny bit about it, and I know we've talked a little bit about it as a team, but I'm put that as a note. So I will check on that and get back with you. I just don't know as much about PassPerfect as I would like to. I haven't worked with that community as much. There's a question here about, did your workshop cover works by artists, photographers, painters, visual artists? Copyright always stays in the domain of the artist. That's really interesting. I mean, sometimes artists, I mean, when I think about like all the sharing, and as a person who creates, and I'm a mixed media painter in addition to this, but you know, a lot of times when we do exhibits or we contribute our work even to Facebook, but you know, if we share our work any place, a lot of times we do have to review the copyright or to take a look at the copyright. So it doesn't, the default is that it would be with the artist, but there are lots of times when it might not be. So I do think that might be an interesting conversation to have as part of your copyright workshop, is to kind of talk through that. You know, photographers gets to be a really tricky situation, because you have people who, you know, do things like Instagram and share a lot of photography these days, and don't necessarily, they're not necessarily selling work commercially, and they would not think about that work commercially too. So a photograph, there's sort of a photograph and a photograph, right? There's kind of the photograph that a commercial photographer is putting out, perhaps with a watermark or not, and you know, it's under copyright and they don't want anybody else to use it. There's certainly that situation. There are situations where artists like Flickr and some of these other places where they're actually assigning rights to that. And then of course we photograph a lot of things, especially when you start looking at three-dimensional objects. We photograph them in order to have that surrogate or that representation for our digital archive. So let's say you have a collection of furniture and you want to be able to share that collection of furniture with people. Well, they either have to come to the museum to look at that furniture, or another way would be to take a photograph of that furniture and put that photograph, perhaps of different angles of the furniture, but still you would put that photograph into your Omeka as that representative or that surrogate for the furniture. Now you might say, like, if you want to see this table, you know, come to our museum, but you know, that photograph is really meant to represent that particular object. So photography is, I think, especially tricky, because we do use photographs as surrogates for real things. And those kind of photographs are typically handled much more differently than, say, like what a commercial photographer would do. I do think it's a very interesting discussion, and I definitely think that would be something to consider, not so much for your surrogates, because if you're taking photographs of three-dimensional things because you want to share with people and you want to create that page and talk about the furniture or whatever it is that you're going to, like, oh, and here's the diary of the author, and here's the desk that the author sat at, and you want to build this whole experience around a particular author and to be able to show them that kind of stuff, then obviously that photograph is going to be a little bit different than, say, a portrait that was taken of that particular author. So I do think it's a really good question, and I think it's something to, it's probably really nuanced in terms of discussion. Hopefully that answers that question. Let's see, Grant, I do not think.
Yes, hi Robin.
Hi.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. As you were talking, there are obviously different elements in Omeka that are also available in other software systems. So as you were talking about, how you can have multiple sites under one, I thought of, and different user permissions, I thought of something like WordPress multi-site, or the fact that Drupal, is really good at offering different user permissions and different levels of access. And then, when you talked about exhibitions, I thought, and the blocks and the modules, I thought, okay, it sounds a bit like WordPress, where you can have, it's now a block-based content management system, and the modules are kind of like plugins.
Yes.
So I was just wondering, what is it about Omeka that is kind of unique for this type of work, maybe cultural work or developing exhibitions? Is it the fact that it does all of this in one, or?
I will say I'm a WordPress Drupal person too.
Okay, yeah, no, I saw your profile somewhere, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so I've that too. Yeah, really, it's really interesting because, like, really my background is, like, I came from like this metadata digital archives world, but I got really interested in like content management systems. So then I got really interested in like WordPress and Drupal and stuff like that. So I definitely have looked at that stuff and played with it. Where I think, and this is my feeling based upon using all these different systems, where Omeka really shines, you have the support for that metadata. So that is something, like, if you start really trying to use WordPress to do this, you're going to have to find some plugins. You're going to have to, oh gosh, you're going to have to like kind of make this yourself. You know what I'm saying? You're not going to just have this out of the box where it's like, okay, it supports Dublin Core. And, to really, to have like Dublin Core built out of the box, or for those of you who may be coming from more of like a library standpoint, to have support for those RDA vocabularies. So that there's your potential to, like, depend on what your integrated library system looks like, depending on what your ILS looks like, there's your potential to kind of hook into that metadata too. So, you have that potential to hook into whatever you're doing over in the library world with your, books and magazines and journals and all that kind of stuff. And then you also have, if you have any kind of institutional repository or scholarly communication tools, if you're using Fedora or DSpace, you have the ability to hook into that. And the fact that it is using these standard metadata formats, and it has the ability to work with some of these very sort of more traditional library platforms in terms of that metadata formats, to me, that is something that you just can't, like, I've seen some attempts to do this in Drupal and they just have gone nowhere, because, that's not really how people want to use Drupal. And then, like, to build an exhibit, that's the other piece of it too. To build those exhibits is so complicated. And we didn't really go through the exhibit building process, but I mean, that was a pretty, just like what I showed you there with, like, oh, here's how you do a block, and we just added text, and it took what, 2 seconds to add text. Now, true, I could have written a lot more, and I could have put some images in, I could put some links in, and you know, it could have taken me a little bit more than 2 seconds, but for the purposes of showing you how quick and easy it is to create these, the mechanism to create it, I think, is very straightforward. So I think the two things that Omeka does beautifully, one, the ability for each site to look different. So you can pick all these different themes and you can make it look the way you want it. And, you know, you may want mapping and someone else doesn't want mapping. They're like, we have nothing to go on a map. We don't need that. So that's fine. You can have a completely different user experience. The other piece of it for me is the support for the metadata, because there is your bridge to other systems. If you have standard metadata, then you can import it, you can share it between systems, you can do so much more than you can do with like WordPress or Drupal in terms of that. And then the other piece of it is the block approach, which other content management systems do have the block approach, but to be able to take these very robust items with this wonderful, very structured metadata, and to be able to put that into an exhibit, I think is a very neat kind of thing. So I think the fact that it is really built to do this, and in some ways it's a very specialized tool, whereas like WordPress or Drupal is kind of like, okay, here it is, you figure out what you're going to build with it. Instead, we're like, okay, here's how you're going to build a page, and we're going to show you kind of how to build that exhibit approach kind of right out of the box. So I think the fact that it's more specialized, the support for the metadata, being able to have one installation and all the sites and have them differ, I think that makes it kind of special.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks for the explanation. I think the fact that you can, as you say, integrate with existing library and metadata systems, and then kind of pull materials out of those collections and display them is, yeah, is what I would see as the key unique factor.
Yeah, and even the fact that you know, even the fact you can use like Library of Congress subject headings, and you can use all of these various thesauri that would be, you know, typically used with library materials. That to me is sort of a strength that Omeka has kind of built in, that it's like, okay, that's sort of part of what we do. And the fact then that everything can be published out as linked data, you know, that's moving this kind of material and these kind of resources really forward in terms of that semantic web kind of stuff that, like in archives and digital humanities and libraries, we're all kind of talking about the semantic web, but like, how are we going to get there? like what's the path? And this kind of makes it easy because it's baked in a lot of ways. So I think that piece of it too, that even though it's maybe not the most exciting piece of it, but in terms of being able to justify like why this would be a valuable resource, not only the support for different kinds of metadata and the ability to bridge between different resources, but then also that linked data capacity as well, that it is moving us forward, and especially moving this kind of material forward towards more of a semantic approach. And yes, as Keith mentions, many people using the same structure and system can help each other. And I think that's the other part of it too, and I haven't really mentioned this part of it, but we do have a user forum, and we are all in the user forum. You know, everybody on the team gets all of, you know, we see when something's posted to the forum, and one of us will almost always jump in. Now, if it's a third-party plugin, that's something that, or module that we do not, that we're not supporting because it's just not ours, then, you know, we may have to refer people back to the organization or the person who created it. But in terms of, you know, answering questions, we do try our best to answer questions, even for things that that aren't ours. It's like if I know that, for example, Neatline, which is a timeline product, I know that they have a website, and, a user form and all that kind of stuff. I'll send people back to that. And really the forum is truly a great help. And part of it is because we are all there. And so unlike WordPress or Drupal, if you go post something to the forum, you're not necessarily getting the team. You're just getting some other user to help you. Now, the same thing may happen with the Omeka forums too, where you get someone, another member of the community helps. And that's one of the things we want to continue to develop, is that the community is helping each other, because we are a small team, but we are also there to help too. Let's see, Deborah, did you have another question? No. Okay. Grant, did you have another question?
Sorry, I was muted.
Oh, okay.
Is it okay if I go quick?
Yes, go. Yes.
Okay, sorry. So when you spoke about linking to another resource that one doesn't have copyright to, like a video somewhere or something else sitting somewhere else. So you talked about sort of creating context about that item that you were linking to. I'm trying to understand it in terms of items. So if I wanted to, let's say, link to an item I didn't have copyright to, but I wanted to frame it even down to sort of metadata in a way, can I do that? So can I give new metadata to an object that's somewhere else that I don't have copyright to, but that I'm linking to? So I'm not adding the item as a digital object, but I'm wanting to frame the item with my metadata. Can I do that?
Yes. So when you add an item, and an item can be, somebody's in here playing too. So when you add an item, you still fill out the information about it. So you can choose your resource template, and you can create more templates. So you're not necessarily, as you see here, we have one template that's a very local template, the Martha Washington template, but you can create other templates. So, we're just going to choose base template. That'll give us all of our fields here. And so so this would be how we would describe that resource, even though it's linked somewhere else. And then when we go over to media, that's where we would add our URL for where that is. So the values that are here are still going to be the values that you provide. So that would be whatever information you're going to provide about it. Now, if I were going to be describing something that was on another website, of course, I would want to make sure that the rights are clearly explained, that it belongs to whoever it belongs to. I might also certainly under creator, but I might also in the description write a little bit more about it. There's other places, maybe even relationship, I might do something there. So, I would definitely look very carefully about those resources. And I would want to make sure that people clearly knew from my description, from my metadata work, that this did not belong to me, but that I was linking to it, which is perfectly acceptable in most cases. Now, like I said, sometimes with photographers and artists and things like that, they may say like no linking, I want no linking to my artwork. And so, that does occasionally happen. You usually will see it on the website where it'll be something like,
Okay.
Don't link to our resource, don't link to my resources without permission or something like that. Or sometimes if you try to link to things, it just, it just shuts it down. It just won't let you do it. But here's where you would describe exactly what it is. And like I said, you have lots of different places where you can explain sort of that person and how that information is related.
Okay, great. A quick last question related to this is, what would you see as the item if you didn't hold the item?
What you're going to see is that what you're going to see is just the link unless you are embedding that item in. So it's going to kind of depend upon it's really going to kind of depend upon what that item is and exactly what it's going to look like. So yes, so a couple of things as we wrap up here, do take a look, and you can watch through the presentation again. I would take a look at least at a couple of those sites and really think through, like, if maybe pick one of them that looks more like what you would want to do in terms of what kind of material you have, or maybe how you would want to organize your site, and really think about, like, okay, if I were going to do this with my resources, you know, what would my navigation look like? What would my structure look like? What would my item sets look like? And you may know already what your item sets are like. I've worked with people who are like, yeah, we already know what our item sets are going to be because we have these collections in the museum, and those are just going to be our item sets. And it's like, okay, there you go. You've got that. So, you know, just looking at the examples, and then looking at what you want to do, like what functionality do you really want to have for your particular site? And then you will have the ability to play and kind of practice. And Keith posted in the chat the link to sign up. So you'll want to go ahead and do that if you want to be able to play and practice. And then the other piece of it is, as you're kind of thinking about your resources, thinking about what your site would look like, you know, if there's anything that you're like, gosh, I just don't know about that, or I have a lot of questions about that, go ahead and send those to Keith, and then we can talk about those in training. So I can actually go through like how to set up a vocabulary, or I can go through how to import using the CSV import, or whatever it is that you might need a little bit more help with. So be thinking about what you have, what resources you have, thinking more about what questions you have about those resources. And then, you know, I can go step by step. And this is just a tour to kind of get you started, to kind of get you thinking about what you want to do. And, you know, compile those questions. And then I will actually, when we do training, then at that point, I will actually pull in those questions, and we'll go step by step, and we'll talk through all the different angles, at least in terms of what I can do. There may be decisions that you will need to make at a higher level in terms of like, how is this project going to go, and that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff I can't help you with, but I can help you with the mechanics of how do you do things. And, you know, what choices do you have in terms of modules and stuff like that? Any final questions before we sign off here and wrap up? Yes, thank you all so much. I hope you're really excited about Omeka. I'll just have to say that when I found Omeka, when I was working on my project, it just was the coolest thing ever. And I was just so amazed by what I could do with it. And it did take a little bit of work to kind of get it the way I wanted and all that kind of stuff. But the fact that it had all the support for the metadata that I really wanted, and to be able to move back and forth, was just fantastic. And the ability to create these really cool little pages, and to pull together all different kinds of content, and to be able to explain it to people, to provide that contextual information, was just such a wonderful, wonderful thing for my resources. And I do think there's a lot of great, exciting possibilities. Hopefully I've given you enough site planning kind of things to think about. And I will say, if you do a little bit of planning, then the actual like setting it up and getting going goes a little bit faster and is a little bit more smoother. But certainly you can be more organic and just kind of be like, oh, I'll get a site going and then try this and try that. You can do that too. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for hanging with it. And yes, I hope to see you in a couple of weeks when we do training. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and I